My name is Mark Seymour. I'm a Rixties tour guide and a private guide, and I live here in Brittany in western France.
So this is our home here in the heart of Brittany. Very rural, very lovely. Enjoy living here. It's actually a three-storey house. One up there, another one there, another one down there. The basement story is obviously garage, utility room, storage areas. There's a wine cellar, living room, kitchen, dining room, bathrooms, office on that floor, and then upstairs we have a 3 bedrooms, bathroom. Nice home.
So wander through two villages with me, Rochefort and Noyal Muzillac. Noyal Muzillac is where I live. Rochefort is a small village just up the road, very, very beautiful indeed. Timber frame buildings, granite structures everywhere. Still very medieval in its look and feel. The type of foods that we would eat in this area, you find a lot of apples, you find a lot of cider. They don't produce wine in Brittany. We don't produce wine at all. Since the 1960s, when the Pays de Loire, or a large portion of Brittany was carved off and became the Pays de Loire, we've produced no wine here in the Department of Brittany at all, just cider. And a thing that some of you may be familiar with, Calvados, yes, of course, comes from that region, but here in Brittany they produce their own as well, an apple spirit, if you will. Quite delicious. Those of you who know me know I would like
here
that.
In my small village, as in many small villages all over France, you find these. If you're not familiar with them, these are boule or pétanque courts, very often made of clay, very often made of sand. Here, just peat and clay, and it's sort of a communal activity. Here, set amongst the trees.
Entering the village, we have the remains of a fortified tower. This would have been part of a very large manoir, which formed the central point of the village of Noyal Muzillac. And here's the local spring, a very elaborate affair, controlled by the church for centuries, of course. Fresh water, controlled by the church. Yep, you get it. But the fresh water itself also supplied this. This is a pool, a lavery. This is where the women would bring their dirty linens, their clothing. It would all be washed here in a rather communal affair in this large pool. One day a week, no doubt paying the church for the privilege.
I'm walking into the village and you can see there's a little chapel there. It's the 14th century from the best of our knowledge. There don't seem to be many records on it.
I'm going to take you through these villages. I'm going to let you look at the timber frames. I'm going to let you look at the slate roofs. I'm going to let you look at the granite walls, look at the cobbled streets. Just have a look at it, so that you can sense and feel what it would be like to live in a place such as this, as I do. The people here are genuinely lovely. I know there's this stigma attached to the French about a certain snootiness or snobbiness. I think there's stigmas attached to all of us, aren't there? But certainly here in Western France, as it is now in Brittany, the people are very down to earth. They are in large part farming folk, fishing folk. Very hardy, very down to earth. I have great respect for them. I'm very fond of many of them who are friends, and it is a beautiful and charming place to live.
They have some sort of exhibition going on. Very often art festivals and so on are held in these places. And here's the cemetery. We've just walked past the cemetery, but here's the war memorial. Here in Brittany, there was great resistance to the German invasion and occupation, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. There's the cemetery. village cemetery. Very pretty, very nicely kept. And here we are again back at the War Memorial. This has great significance to the French. In England, wherever you go, every time you go into a village, 83,000 villages in Britain, only 12 of them don't have a war memorial. Here in France it's a similar situation.
Here in France is a similar situation. As I say, war memorials adorn the entrance to every village, every community in France, particularly so here in Brittany. Brittany was always considered a third-class citizen by the French, politically, culturally. So going into World War I, troops were conscripted. There were a few volunteers at the beginning of the war for sure, but as the war ground on, the French needed troops. Anybody would do. They couldn't necessarily equip all of the troops they conscripted. But here in Brittany, they conscripted tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men. They put them in pretty poor uniforms. Many of them weren't armed, many of them weren't shod, and they were marched off to the front. And the losses were horrific. Now, I'll give you some statistics. I feel that in Britain we suffered tragically during that war, the Great War as we call it. The Bretons statistically lost so much more. The outbreak of the war, there were about 3.25 million Bretons. Let's cut that into two, men and women. Let's say 1.75 million men. Let's say a third of them were of fighting age at the outbreak of the war. We'll just round it down. Let's say 500,000 young men were recruited, put into uniform, and sent off to fight. These are very general numbers. What we do know for sure is how many lost their lives. And in a later episode, I'll show you a memorial at a place called Saint-Anne-d'Auray, another small village up the road. The most massive, the most tragic war memorial I've ever seen. And I have been to Washington, D.C. and the Cenotaph in London. There are the names of 250,000 young Bretons who lost their lives. That's a half of those who went off to fight, going by that statistic. Of course, those men didn't come back. In a rural community, they weren't able to work on the fields because they weren't here. Those who did return were disabled in some way. Whole villages, whole communities died. They withered on the vine, and they died. Womenfolk went to live with family members in other areas of France, and Brittany once again became a backwater. So from 1918 onwards, between the wars, going to World War II, very, very underpopulated, a very poor region within France, at a time when every part of Europe was poor, the Great Depression. And then we go into World War II. And World War II, patriotism, nationalism, and I mean Breton nationalism, was on the rise again because of the way they'd been treated by the French superiors, as they deemed them to be. And the French authorities found it very hard to recruit troops from this region to fight in World War II. And of course, the war was over pretty quickly for the French anyway. Germans came through with all sorts of promises, and they said, we'll give you your French independence. We'll give you your Breton independence if you just don't fight us, don't resist us. We'll come in, we'll set up an infrastructure, and then we'll give you your independence. Well, wasn't that a lie? The Germans arrived, unopposed by the Bretons, at the outbreak of World War II. They marched in and they started setting up shops and building their fortress. Fortress Europe, as the Germans call it. They started putting concrete bunkers all the way around the coast of Brittany, a peninsula, and using slave labour. They brought slave labour in from all over the conquered territories in Europe, but they also conscripted, I'm using a gentle word there, some of the Breton folk to do the work for them as well. Now at this point, Breton menfolk realised things weren't going the way they thought it was going to go. They weren't going to get their independence, and there was a great uprising. Something you may never have heard about, but supported by special air services from Britain, specially trained French operatives, part of the Free French forces fighting from Britain, and also part of the special air services themselves, were dropped into this corner of France, and between them they managed to mobilize, arm and equip about 3,500 French farmers who became the Marquis, the partisans. And throughout much of the war, these men put up a ferocious contest. They tied down essentially two full German divisions here for much of the war, particularly leading into and during the D-Day landings and the Normandy invasion. At horrific loss. You've all heard the stories of what the Germans would do to partisans, and there were many lives lost. In fact, there are very few villages in this central part of Brittany that you can't drive into without seeing a plaque on a wall or a memorial marker to local people who lost their lives fighting the German forces. Every small village here in Brittany has a very large church and, of course, a bar to back, a bakery. They are prerequisites, they are requirements. To be a village, you have to have those things. So I'm just going for a walk through the village. I'm going down Juice Street right now. Many villages have streets named after the communities that lived in them. And the church bells, just on time. Many of you who have travelled with me know that I like to describe history through the people and through the landscape. People live in certain areas because those certain areas can give them something. Farming, fishing. It may be that there is wildlife that is of some use to them, historically at least. So people will settle in an area and they will domesticate that area, they'll make it theirs, and they will adapt to it, just as they will adapt the landscape to the way they wish to live. So here in Brittany, I've already said they have coastlines, people came, they fished. We have what would have been a very heavily wooded hinterland and a very marshy hinterland. It would have been safe, it would have been difficult to farm, so it was sparsely populated. And even today, that's still applicable. Since the 1960s, I have to say, with the advent of large cooperatives, central Brittany has been farmed, it's been developed, but in a very beautiful way. The woodlands have been preserved in large part, and the farmland is open and wild, and just looks beautiful as you drive through it, with very few large towns, very, very few large towns. Another thing that's peculiar to this part of the world, I've already mentioned the word granite. Certainly geologically you have granite, you also have schist. When you look at some of the ancient, the prehistory, the standing stones, you can see those monuments to the geology on the landscape. You see granitic menhirs, the standing stones. You see schist stones and tombs. But something else that you also see a lot of is slate. Slate is in abundance here, and it's a black slate. Those of you who have been to Paris will have seen Breton slate, slate from Brittany. Those of you who've been to some of the big stations in Brittany, in Paris, will notice that there are creperies all the way around those large stations. That's because the slate was moved in the 1800s, 1900s into Paris to provide roofing material for the citizens of Paris. after, at a time when the city was growing and flourishing, the Bresson labour, the workforce, moved with the slate to Paris to roof those homes. Mass migration, yes, certainly. It meant that a lot of the workforce here in Brittany was migrating to Paris. But that was at a time when Brittany was now a part of France. As I've already said, Brittany was independent from France really until the 16th century. So, before the 1600s, you have beautiful isolated wilderness areas with small communities of people living off the land, doing a little bit of mining for slate and granite. And not a lot going on. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were various wars, there was conflict, of course, as there was all over the face of Europe. Much of it not very well documented, because Brittany was always a backwater. Much as the southwest of England was always a bit of a backwater, Brittany was definitely a bit of a backwater as well. Now, we've spoken about the war memorials that you find at the entrance to all of the villages here in this area, certainly. But something else you find are these incredible testaments to the religious beliefs of the area. Primarily Roman Catholics, and ardently so, in my opinion. I know there is a feeling that here in France they're becoming more secular. I'm British. We are a very secular nation. Our churches are empty. Here in France, the churches are still full. This part of France certainly is still full on a Sunday morning. And these terrifying crosses you find at the entrance to every small village.
So this is the small village of Rochefort on Terre. It's a village of great character, as the French would call it. Very, very pretty village of national prestige and renown, and it's just up the road, about 5 kilometres from where we live. I have to say there are many beautiful villages like this in this area.
Now, as you look at this image of the crutch frame, timber frame building, crutch frame, think of that word crutch. Now I want you to imagine a tree in the forest. A woodsman goes out, he's contracted to help build a home in the middle of this little village. He goes out to find a beautiful tree, a great oak tree. He finds the perfect tree, they cut it down at the trunk. They drag it back to the village, and they strip all of the bark off, they strip the leaves off, they strip the branches off, and they turn this Y shape upside down, cutting the trunk off at the top to create the gable end, or the crutch frame, to support the roof. I love these. You see them all over Europe. I point them out when I'm touring through the British Isles to my tour members, but there's a beautiful example right here in Rochefort on Terre. On the clay pack floor, they would have large oak beams, creating essentially a cube, a square, a frame, from which they would have upright oaks, green oaks, and everything would then be trussed together, strutted together with the roof itself holding everything in place. Once the main beams are put in, you then come back with what we call wattle and daub, and you can see up there within the crux frame the whitewashed walls. This would have been basket work, caked with mud and muck and mire, horsehair maybe, anything that would bind the muck to the basket work. Makes a wonderfully strong, durable material. And there are cases that I know of both here in France and in Britain where the wattle and daub, to daub the muck, has survived for 600 and 700, 800 years. It's a wonderfully durable, waterproof material. You then paint the whole of the exterior muck with a lime wash, which waterproofs it, and of course gives it that white look to it. Wattle and daub construction, timber frame construction. We're looking at 14th, 15th, 16th century buildings, timber frame, granite structures. Over here on the right, with the red umbrellas, a friend of ours owns a little bar cafe there that goes underneath the streets. It's a beautiful town. It's known for its floral displays throughout the year, and at Christmas, great light displays. Its name Rochefort means strong rocks on Terre. So essentially a granite village on top of a hill. Strategic, it's defensive. But look at these lovely planters. These are old tombs or old coffins, caskets to you, I guess. Now we're going to walk up towards the chateau ramparts. The village itself has a chateau or a small castle. That was a home, but also very visibly defended. You can see the walls right here with some defensive towers. They command a position over a gorge that cuts through the ridge here in central Brittany. Very strong structure, very defensive position, controlling the wealth that flows from north to south across the province itself. As we walk around the chateau or castle walls, we can see a small chapel there, a beautiful little family chapel set within the walls, overlooking what was once upon a time a small moat. The chateau became a hospital during World War I, and one of the soldiers who was rehabilitated here inside the hospital came back at a later date. After the war, he came back and he bought the chateau, and the chateau is still today in his family's name, family's ownership, although it is also a protected trust building. It's only open at certain days of the week, so I can't take you in there today. And even then, it's not always open. This is the French way. You're never really sure when something's going to be open, particularly in rural France, but it's not open today, so I can't take you in. But it is quite a magnificent structure, as you can see. We're now heading down to the local village church, quite an impressive structure dedicated to the Madonna of Tronçais. There's a lovely story surrounding it. There's a lovely legend attached to this church. In the 10th century, there was a Viking horde that attacked the area, and the local statue of the Madonna was hidden from the ransacking hordes in the trunk of a tree, Tronçais. 2 centuries later, a local shepherdess found that Madonna in the trunk of a tree, and it became a shrine. And that shepherdess was sanctified or became a saint here in this local area. It's one of the ways in which you could become a saint in those days. There are about 1,600 local saints in Brittany. Many of them come from the British Isles, from Wales, from Cornwall, from Devon, from Southern Ireland, as those areas are called today. They all have interesting stories attached to them. There are many interesting stories surrounding the early saints of Western Europe, here in Brittany, the British Isles, Ireland, of course. Think of an old, very crude form of religion that arose whilst the Romans were occupying much of Western Europe. A crude form of Christianity, a little bit of a hodgepodge of stories and tales from all over the Middle East, as we would call it today, adopted by local people, hermits, people that became monks perhaps. And this crude form of spirituality, of Christianity, arose. When the Romans left Western Europe, it meant that Christianity was still here, and many of those stories took on a life of their own. Some of the people that practiced and this religious worship took the stories elsewhere. So people from the Irish Isles, people from the British Isles, came into mainland Britain, came into mainland France, bringing those stories with them for a reason. These men, as they will have been, could control resources. They could move into a local area, 2 or 3 of them at a time, move into a local area, make camp essentially over a well, a fresh water, perhaps in amongst a grove of trees, where spirituality had been practiced for many, many centuries before they arrived. They would usurp the old beliefs. They would sit themselves down by those wells, by those trees, and start to tell stories of their new Christianity. And in so doing, they would claim adherence. They were in the right place, and people would come, they'd listen to the stories, they'd listen to the moral behind those stories, and they would pay for the water and for the storytelling, or pay for the use of the trees and the storytelling. And Christianity arose in that very humble way. And where those monks, as we'll call them today, arrived, saints as they eventually became, in the Dark Ages, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, the 8th century, in this part of Europe, those saints, their stories that surround them still survive. Many of the stories are very, very strange, very, very odd, nothing to do with religion whatsoever. As you know, as you've just heard, the shrine based here in Rochefort surrounding the Tronçais, the Madonna of Tronçais, has very little to do with religion. It's about a shepherdess that found a lost Madonna in a tree trunk. They are that mundane. But she found the Madonna. She is a local saint. Now as we walk towards the shrine of Tronkai, you can see off to the south, you can see that we are in a high point looking down into a valley, a steep wooded valley. Actually off to the other side you'll also catch a glimpse that there's a steep drop off there too. This is a very high sheer ridge and the village occupied a very strategic location. There's the shrine in front of us, we're going to head towards that. This shrine actually delineates where the Madonna was found in the tree trunk. Once a year, religious festivals are held in all of these villages. They may be becoming secular, but as I said, they're still very religious. And the religious festivals in this area are called pardons. Very formal, very elaborate affairs indeed. Here in this village, this is where the pardon would be focused. So before the 16th century, before Brittany became part of France, what was it? I want you to understand that the word Britain is not a nation. Yes, it's become that now, but it's a Greek word that the Romans used. They adopted it to describe the people of this area, this region, this corner, this outpost of northwestern Europe, the Britons. I'm generalizing, but just to give you the picture, the Britons. The Brittani, the people who were outside, as I say, Greek word, Brittani, corrupted by the Romans, Britons. So we have Britons all over Western Europe. Eventually the Romans changed the name somewhat, they refined that label and called the people of some of these areas the Armoricans, or Armoricans. So you have the Britons and you have the Armoricans. Now here in Brittany, people historically, long before the Romans ever showed up, were connected by the sea. People all the way around the coastline of Europe were connected by the sea. That was the main thoroughfare. People traveled by boats. It was easier, it was quicker, it was probably safer than crossing via mainland routes. So people here in the peninsula of what is now Western France were connected by birthright, by family ties, by friendships, by trade, by the water. People in the western peninsula of what is now France were connected to the western isles of what is now Great Britain. Many of the names are the same. If you look at some of the ancient traditional names of regions of Brittany, you have places like Cornwall, the Dumnoni, or Dumnoni as the Italians may have called it. But those two place names directly correlate to Cornwall in southwestern England and Devon in southwestern England. So the relationship is very, very close indeed. The language, the mother tongue of Brittany, the mother tongue of the southwest of England, Western Isles of Britain, is essentially the same. So the ties are very, very close. Which means that historically people have moved backwards and forwards. So those family linkages have always been there, which is why even today Brits come to Brittany to vacation, and very often they'll buy a second home here and settle here. And that's why there are so many of us here today. So that answers that question. I live here because my wife lives here. As many of you know, I'm very proud of being British. My wife is the same generation as me. She and I, we both moved out of the United Kingdom at a time when the United Kingdom was in despair in the late 70s, early 80s. Many Brits of my age, we left. I went to the States. Colleagues of mine went to Italy. Other people came to France. Mass unemployment in Britain, we moved overseas. And that's why also there are people of my generation living here in Brittany. It was the natural place to come.